They thought denying her would be a small decision, but within minutes, it would become the most expensive mistake of their lives. The glass doors of the Grand Aurora Hotel rotated smoothly as guests in tailored suits and polished heels stepped inside, greeted by warm golden light spilling from crystal chandeliers that hung nearly 20 feet above the marble floor, the kind of place where every surface reflected wealth, where every detail whispered exclusivity without ever raising its voice, and where status wasn't just expected, it was silently enforced. 30 minutes later, a man in a navy suit would stand in that same lobby and quietly end multiple careers with a single sentence, but right now, no one knew that yet. Right now, Evelyn Carter stepped through those same doors unnoticed. She wore a simple beige coat that had seen better winters, her dark hair tied back in a loose, practical knot, her shoes comfortable rather than impressive, the kind of appearance that didn't invite attention and, in places like this, didn't earn respect either. She paused just inside the entrance, not uncertain, not intimidated, but observant, her eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the front desk where two attendants smiled brightly at a well-dressed couple, the concierge leaning slightly forward to assist a businessman with a leather briefcase, the bellhop rushing past with a polished luggage cart, all moving in a rhythm that was seamless for some and invisible to others. No one greeted her. Not a glance. Not a nod. Not even the polite, welcome, that was scripted into every employee's training manual. It wasn't hostility. It was something quieter. Something colder. It was dismissal. Evelyn took a few measured steps forward, the soft echo of her shoes against the marble barely audible beneath the hum of conversation and the distant chime of an elevator, and as she approached the front desk, one of the attendants briefly looked up, her eyes scanning Evelyn in less than a second, cataloging her coat, her shoes, her lack of visible status, before returning her attention to the couple in front of her with a brighter, warmer smile than before. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. You can wait. Or you can leave. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stood there, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture relaxed but steady, her expression calm in a way that suggested she wasn't surprised by any of this. A few feet away, a woman in a sharp charcoal blazer approached, her heels clicking with authority against the polished floor, her name tag catching the light, Laura Whitmore, Guest Relations Manager. She didn't rush. People in her position never did. Control was maintained through pace, through tone, through the quiet confidence of someone who believed they understood exactly who belonged and who didn't. She stopped just short of Evelyn, offering a smile that was technically perfect but emotionally absent, the kind of smile that existed only because it had to. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice smooth, measured, professional in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Evelyn met her gaze, her eyes steady, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, I'd like to check in." There was a pause, barely noticeable, but long enough for Laura's eyes to flick down again, reassessing, recalculating, confirming her initial judgment. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, already knowing the answer she expected to hear. "No," Evelyn replied. "I don't." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Just enough to shift the tone. Laura's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid we're fully booked," she said, her voice still polite, but now carrying the faint edge of finality, the kind that didn't invite further conversation. Behind Evelyn, a couple walking in glanced briefly at the interaction before continuing toward the elevators, uninterested. At the desk, the attendants avoided eye contact. The room adjusted itself around the moment, subtly aligning with Laura's judgment, as if her words had already been accepted as truth. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering, as the silence stretched just a second longer than was comfortable, the kind of silence that most people rush to fill, but she didn't. She let it sit. She let it breathe. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifted, though no one in the room could quite name it yet. Laura tilted her head slightly, her tone cooling by a degree. "There are several other hotels within a mile," she added, gesturing vaguely toward the street outside. You might find something more suitable. The word hung in the air, carefully chosen, carefully delivered, and just ambiguous enough to sound polite while meaning something else entirely. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly at her side, not in anger, not in embarrassment, but in something more controlled, more deliberate, and for the first time, her gaze moved, not away, but past Laura, toward the far end of the lobby, toward the entrance where the revolving doors continued their quiet, endless motion, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. The room, still busy, still elegant, still unaware, carried on as usual, but the balance had already begun to tilt, and none of them, not the attendants, not the guests, not even Laura Whitmore, had any idea that within minutes, the quiet woman they had just dismissed would become the reason the entire room fell silent. Laura Whitmore had delivered that line countless times before, always with the same controlled tone, always with the same quiet authority that came from years of deciding who belonged within those polished walls and who did not, and in almost every case the person on the receiving end would hesitate, apologize, or leave without protest, their confidence dissolving under the weight of her certainty, but Evelyn Carter did none of those things. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if the words had landed somewhere outside of her rather than on her, and that alone was enough to create a subtle disturbance in the carefully managed rhythm of the lobby, something almost imperceptible but real, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect symphony. Laura shifted her weight, a small movement, but one that revealed the first hint of irritation beneath her polished exterior, because people were not supposed to respond with silence, they were supposed to respond with compliance, and the longer Evelyn remained still, the more that silence began to stretch into something uncomfortable, something that drew attention without asking for it. At the front desk, one of the attendants glanced up again, this time holding her gaze a fraction longer than before, curiosity beginning to replace dismissal, while a man seated near the lounge area lowered his newspaper just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the interaction before quickly returning to the page as if unwilling to be seen watching. "Ma'am," Laura said again, this time with a touch more firmness, her smile thinning just enough to signal that patience was not unlimited, "if you do not have a reservation, there is nothing more we can do for you here." The words were still professional, still within the boundaries of acceptable service language, but the warmth had faded, replaced by a subtle insistence that the conversation was already over. Evelyn's eyes did not leave Laura's face. There was no challenge in them, no visible defiance, just a calm that did not match the situation, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, almost gentle. "Are you certain?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it landed differently than expected, not as a plea, not as confusion, but as something closer to confirmation, as if she were giving Laura one more opportunity to reconsider a decision that had already been made. Laura let out a quiet breath through her nose, the kind that never quite became a sigh but carried the same meaning, and for the first time, a trace of condescension slipped into her tone. "I am absolutely certain," she replied. "We are fully committed tonight." She paused, then added, her words carefully measured, "and we prioritize our registered guests." The implication was clear, even if it remained unspoken. Evelyn's fingers relaxed slightly at her side, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something only she understood. "I see," she said. For a moment it appeared as though she might turn and leave, and the room seemed to anticipate that outcome, the tension easing just enough for the surrounding conversations to begin resuming their normal volume, but instead, Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, her movements unhurried, deliberate, drawing just enough attention to make the nearby attendants glance over once more. She looked down at the screen, her thumb hovering for a second before she tapped a single contact, then lifted the phone to her ear. There was no rush in her posture, no sign of frustration, just quiet intention. Laura watched this with narrowed eyes, her expression carefully neutral but her thoughts beginning to shift, because this was not the reaction she expected, and unpredictability, even in something as small as this, was something she had learned to correct quickly. "If you are calling to make a reservation," Laura said, her voice now edged with a polite impatience, "I can assure you that will not change our availability." Evelyn did not respond to her. She was listening. The line on the other end had connected, and after a brief pause, she spoke, her voice still calm, still controlled. "I am in the lobby," she said. "Nothing more. No explanation. No urgency." Just that single sentence, delivered with a quiet certainty that did not match the situation as Laura understood it. Then she lowered the phone, ending the call before any response could be heard, and slipped it back into her pocket. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was something heavier, something that carried expectation, even if no one could yet explain why. Laura straightened slightly, her shoulders pulling back as she reasserted control over the moment, because whatever this was, it needed to end, and it needed to end now. "Ma'am," she said, her tone now firm enough to leave no room for interpretation, "if you are not a guest, I am going to have to ask you to step aside so we can assist others." The words were sharper this time, the politeness still present but stretched thin, and a few feet away, one of the attendants shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something had crossed from routine into something else, something that might not resolve as cleanly as expected. Evelyn did not move. She simply stood there, her gaze drifting once more toward the entrance, toward the revolving doors that continued their slow, steady motion, and as she waited, the faint sound of footsteps began to echo across the marble floor, measured, deliberate, approaching from the direction of the entrance, each step cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the lobby, and though no one had turned yet, though no one had fully registered the change, something in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself were preparing for a moment it did not yet understand. The sound of those footsteps did not rush, did not announce themselves with urgency, but they carried something far more powerful than speed, a quiet authority that moved through the lobby like a shift in pressure, subtle yet impossible to ignore, and one by one, without quite knowing why, people began to notice, a concierge pausing mid-sentence, a bellhop slowing his stride, the man with the newspaper lowering it again, this time not pretending to look away, because the rhythm of the room had changed, and even those who did not understand the reason could feel it. The revolving doors turned once more, and as they settled, a man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that caught the light just enough to reveal its precision, not flashy, not loud, but unmistakably expensive, the kind of presence that did not need introduction because it carried its own gravity. His shoes crossed the marble floor with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one steady, and though he did not raise his voice, did not signal for attention, the space seemed to adjust around him as he moved forward, staff members instinctively straightening, conversations lowering by a fraction, as if the room itself recognized something that the people within it had not yet fully processed. Laura Whitmore noticed him too, of course she did, and for a brief moment her expression reset into something sharper, more attentive, the professional instinct to identify a high-value guest activating instantly, her posture shifting, her smile preparing to return with warmth this time, genuine or at least convincingly so, but before she could step forward, before she could redirect her attention, the man's path did not lead to the front desk, it did not lead to the concierge, it led directly toward Evelyn Carter. That was the moment the air changed completely. He stopped just beside her, not in front, not behind, but next to her, his presence aligning with hers rather than overshadowing it, and for a second, neither of them spoke, but the connection between them was immediate, clear, unmistakable to anyone watching closely enough. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her calm expression unchanged, and met his gaze with the same quiet steadiness she had held since the moment she entered the building. "You are here," she said softly. It was not a question. It was confirmation. The man gave a small nod, his eyes briefly scanning her face, not for information, but for reassurance, as if checking something unspoken, something only the two of them understood, and then his attention shifted, slowly, deliberately, toward Laura Whitmore. The transition was subtle, but the effect was immediate. Laura felt it before she fully understood it, a tightening in her chest, a flicker of uncertainty that had not been there before, because this was no longer a routine interaction, this was something else, something she had not prepared for, and in that fraction of a second, her confidence hesitated. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her voice smoothing itself back into professional warmth, stepping forward with renewed composure. "Welcome to the Grand Aurora Hotel, how may I assist you today? The words were perfect, practiced, but they landed into a silence that did not respond the way she expected. The man did not return her smile. He did not acknowledge her greeting in the usual way. Instead, he looked at her with a calm, measured expression that held no hostility, no raised emotion, but also no warmth, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying easily across the space without ever needing to rise. I believe you have already assisted us, he said. The words were simple, but something in the way he said them caused the nearby attendants to freeze mid-movement, their hands stilling on keyboards, their attention drawn fully into the moment now, because the tone did not match the situation they thought they were witnessing. Laura blinked once, her smile faltering just slightly, recalibrating, searching for the correct response. I apologize if there has been any confusion, she replied quickly, we are currently at full capacity, but I would be happy to. He raised a hand, not abruptly, not aggressively, but enough to pause her sentence, a gesture that was small yet absolute in its effect. The lobby, already quieter, seemed to lean into the moment. You informed my wife, he said, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged, that she does not belong here. The word wife landed like a shift in gravity, subtle in sound, but massive in implication, and for a brief second, Laura's expression froze, not completely, but enough for the first crack to appear beneath the surface of her control, because this was not the direction the conversation was supposed to take, this was not the structure she understood, and the pieces no longer aligned the way they had just moments before. Around them, the room had gone still, not silent yet, but close, the kind of stillness that precedes realization, and Evelyn remained exactly where she had been, calm, composed, her presence unchanged, as if she had known this moment was coming from the very beginning, as if everything that had just happened was simply part of a sequence that was now unfolding exactly as expected. Laura Whitmore felt the shift before she could process the meaning of his words, a subtle tightening in the air that pressed against her composure, because in all her years managing that lobby, controlling its flow, shaping its tone, she had never been addressed like this, not with calm authority, not with a statement that did not seek approval or explanation, but simply existed as fact, and for the first time, her response did not come instantly. Sir, I believe there has been a misunderstanding, she said, her voice carefully measured, though a faint strain had begun to weave itself into the edges. We treat all guests with the utmost professionalism, however, without a confirmed reservation, we are unable to provide accommodations. She emphasized the word reservation, grounding herself in policy, in structure, in the rules that had always justified her decisions, because rules were safe, rules were predictable, rules protected her. The man listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, and when she finished, he allowed a brief silence to settle, just long enough for the weight of her words to hang in the space between them, just long enough for the people nearby to lean in without realizing they were doing it. Then he spoke again. You are correct, he said calmly. Policies matter. Laura felt a flicker of relief at that, a small anchor returning beneath her feet, because agreement meant control was returning, meant the situation could still be redirected back into something familiar, but the relief lasted only a second. But so does judgment, he continued, his tone never rising, never sharpening, yet somehow cutting more cleanly than anger ever could. And yours failed the moment you decided who deserved to stand here. The words landed softly, but their impact spread outward, rippling through the silence that had now fully taken hold of the lobby, because this was no longer a private exchange, this was something everyone could feel, something no one could ignore. Laura's smile was gone now, replaced by a composed neutrality that was beginning to fracture beneath the surface, her mind moving quickly, searching for footing, for context, for anything that could explain what was happening, because this was not just a guest, this was not just a complaint, this was something else entirely, something she had not anticipated. Sir, she said again, her voice firmer now, attempting to reclaim authority, if you would like to speak with management, I can arrange that. Immediately. It was a calculated move, an attempt to elevate the situation to a higher level, to shift responsibility upward, to regain control through process, but the man's response came without hesitation. You already are speaking with management, he said. There was no emphasis, no dramatic pause, just a simple statement, and yet the effect was immediate, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but begins as a quiet crack and then spreads rapidly, because something in the way he said it, something in the certainty of it, made the words impossible to dismiss. Laura blinked, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the confusion beneath. "I am sorry," she said, the question escaping before she could reshape it into something more controlled. He held her gaze, unwavering. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said. The name settled into the air, and for a brief moment, it meant nothing, just a collection of syllables, just another introduction, but then recognition began to move through the room like a slow wave, starting at the edges, at the concierge desk where a man's eyes widened slightly, at the front desk where one of the attendants inhaled sharply, at the bellhop who froze mid-step, because the name was not unfamiliar, it was known, it was tied to ownership, to the very foundation of the place they were standing in. Laura's expression changed again, more visibly this time, the pieces connecting too quickly for her to stop them, her mind racing through fragments of meetings, of reports, of ownership structures she had never needed to think about beyond titles and signatures, and now those distant details were standing in front of her, real, present, undeniable. Daniel Carter did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply continued. "And this," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Evelyn before returning to Laura, "is Evelyn Carter." He let the name rest there, not explaining, not elaborating, because he did not need to. The realization completed itself in the silence that followed. Laura's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough, her shoulders tightening, her breath catching just slightly, because the certainty she had relied on just minutes ago had dissolved, replaced by something far more dangerous, uncertainty, and with it, the understanding that the decision she had made, the judgment she had trusted, was no longer something she could defend. Around them, the lobby had gone completely still now, conversations halted, movements paused, every eye drawn toward the center of the room, because the story had shifted, the roles had reversed, and the quiet woman who had been dismissed moments ago now stood at the center of something much larger than anyone had realized. Evelyn did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if none of this surprised her, as if she had been here before, as if she had seen this exact moment unfold in different forms, in different places, and had learned long ago that silence, when held long enough, reveals everything. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because the room itself seemed to reject the idea of breaking the silence too soon, as if everyone instinctively understood that whatever came next would matter, that it would define more than just this moment, and Laura Whitmore stood at the center of it, her confidence unraveling in slow, controlled increments, the kind that could not be hidden no matter how carefully she adjusted her posture or steadied her breathing. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice noticeably softer now, the authority replaced with something closer to caution, "I was not aware." Her words trailed off, not because she did not know how to finish the sentence, but because every possible ending felt insufficient, every explanation too small against the weight of what had just been revealed. Daniel Carter did not interrupt her, did not rush her, but he also did not offer any assistance in completing her thought, he simply watched, his expression composed, his silence far more commanding than any raised voice could have been. Around them, the staff remained frozen in place, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension, each of them replaying the last few minutes in their minds, each of them recognizing the same thing at the same time, that they had participated, whether actively or passively, in something they no longer understood how to justify. Evelyn Carter shifted her weight slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to draw attention back to her, not because she demanded it, but because it now naturally belonged to her, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm clarity that cut through the tension without raising its volume. "You did not need to be aware," she said gently. Laura looked at her, startled, unsure whether the statement was meant as forgiveness or something else entirely. "You only needed to treat me like a guest." The words were simple, but they landed with a precision that left no room for defense, because they did not accuse, they did not exaggerate, they simply revealed the truth in its most basic form, and in doing so, they removed every excuse Laura had been searching for. A faint murmur moved through the lobby, quickly suppressed, as if even the guests understood that this was not a moment to interfere with, that they were witnessing something more significant than a typical exchange, something that carried weight beyond inconvenience or policy. Laura's hands tightened slightly at her sides, her composure straining under the pressure of realization, and for the first time, the structure she relied on, the rules, the procedures, the hierarchy, offered her no protection, because none of them addressed what had actually happened. "I apologize," she said finally, the words carefully formed, but lacking the confidence they once would have carried. "This was not our intention." Daniel's gaze remained steady. "Intention is not the issue," he replied calmly. "Impact is." Another silence followed, deeper this time, more complete, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret, only the reality of what had already occurred. He took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but enough to shift the center of the space, and when he spoke again, his voice remained even, controlled, but carried a finality that no one in the room could ignore. "This hotel was built on a standard," he said. "Not just luxury. Not just exclusivity. Respect." Each word landed with measured precision, not rushed, not emphasized, but unmistakable in its meaning. That standard was not upheld today. Laura swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, her mind racing, searching for recovery, for resolution, for any path that might undo what had already been set in motion, but the moment had passed that point, and she could feel it, the irreversible shift from control to consequence. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply looked at her, and then at the staff behind the desk, his gaze moving from one face to another, acknowledging each of them without singling anyone out, because responsibility, in this moment, was shared. "Effective immediately," he said, his tone unchanged, "your roles here are under review." The words were not loud, but they carried through the lobby with absolute clarity, and the effect was immediate, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of shock that moved through both staff and guests alike, because this was not a warning, not a suggestion, it was the beginning of a consequence none of them had anticipated. Laura's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to see the shift, the realization settling fully now, that this was real, that this was happening, and that it had begun with a single decision made just minutes earlier. Evelyn remained still beside Daniel, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not vindictive, simply calm, as if the outcome was not something to celebrate, but something that had always been inevitable. The lobby, once filled with quiet confidence and controlled elegance, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped by understanding, by reflection, by the recognition that something simple, something easily given, had been withheld, and in that absence, everything else had followed. And in that moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been revealed. The words had already settled into the room, but their weight continued to deepen with every passing second, as if the silence itself was absorbing them and redistributing their meaning across every corner of the lobby, and no one moved to interrupt it, not the staff behind the desk, not the guests who had unknowingly become witnesses, not even Laura Whitmore, who stood frozen at the center of a moment she could no longer control, her mind racing not for defense now, but for understanding, for a way to grasp how something so routine had unraveled into something irreversible. Daniel Carter did not look away, his presence steady, not aggressive, not theatrical, but immovable in a way that made resistance feel irrelevant, and after allowing the silence to fully settle, he spoke again, his tone unchanged, but now carrying a direction that shifted the moment from realization to action. "Human resources will be notified," he said calmly, each word placed with intention. "A full review will begin immediately." There was no anger in his voice, no raised volume, but the certainty within it left no room for interpretation, and the effect was immediate, a quiet ripple moving through the staff, shoulders tightening, eyes lowering, the reality of consequence no longer abstract, but present, unfolding in real time. One of the front desk attendants swallowed hard, her hands hovering uncertainly above the keyboard as if unsure whether continuing to work would be appropriate or impossible, while another stepped back slightly, instinctively creating distance from a situation that now felt far beyond her control. Laura finally found her voice again, though it came softer than before, stripped of authority, replaced by something closer to urgency. "Mr. Carter, please," she said, her composure now visibly strained, "if there is anything we can do to correct this, I assure you this does not reflect our usual standards." Her words came carefully, but they lacked the confidence they once carried, because now they were not backed by position or certainty, only by the hope that something could still be salvaged. Daniel listened, his expression unchanged, and when he responded, his voice remained even, but the meaning behind it had sharpened. "Standards are not measured when everything goes right," he said. "They are revealed when they are tested." The sentence hung in the air, simple, undeniable, and for those listening, it carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the hotel, into something broader, something more permanent. Evelyn Carter turned her head slightly, her gaze moving across the lobby, taking in the stillness, the paused conversations, the quiet attention of strangers who had become part of this moment, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no sense of victory, only a calm recognition, as if she had seen this pattern before, as if she understood that this was not about her, not entirely, but about something larger, something that repeated itself in different places, in different forms. "Daniel," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken his name since he arrived, and the sound of it shifted the moment again, not breaking the tension, but redirecting it. He turned his attention to her immediately, the sharp focus he had held on the situation softening just slightly, enough to show that beneath the authority, there was something else, something grounded, something personal. "That is enough," she continued, her voice still calm, still measured, but carrying a quiet finality of its own. There was no demand in her tone, no insistence, but there was certainty, and it landed with the same quiet power his words had carried. Daniel studied her for a brief moment, not questioning, not resisting, but considering, as if weighing something unspoken, and then he gave a small nod, the decision made without the need for further discussion. He turned back to Laura and the staff, his expression returning to its composed neutrality. "The review will proceed," he said, his voice steady. "But what happens next will depend on what you choose to learn from this." It was not forgiveness, not dismissal, but something in between, something that left space for consequence and reflection to exist at the same time. Laura lowered her gaze, the weight of the moment settling fully now, not as shock, not as fear, but as understanding, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what has already happened, but just in time to recognize its meaning. Around them, the lobby remained still, but the tension had shifted, no longer sharp, no longer rising, but settling into something quieter, something reflective, as if the entire space was absorbing the lesson without needing it to be spoken aloud. Evelyn adjusted her coat slightly, a small, ordinary movement that stood in contrast to everything that had just unfolded, and without another word, she stepped forward, her pace unhurried, her presence unchanged, moving past the front desk, past the staff, toward the elevators as if this had always been her path, as if nothing had ever stood in her way. Daniel followed a half step behind, not leading, not directing, but accompanying, his earlier authority now resting quietly beneath the surface, no longer needed in the same way. The marble floor echoed softly beneath their steps as they walked, and the lobby, once defined by quiet luxury, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by expectation, but by realization. And as the elevator doors closed behind them, the room did not immediately return to normal, because something had shifted, something that would not easily reset, and for those who remained, the lesson lingered in the stillness, clear without being spoken, lasting long after the moment itself had passed. The elevator doors closed with a soft, seamless glide, sealing off the noise of the lobby as if it belonged to a different world entirely, and inside the mirrored interior, the atmosphere shifted again, quieter now, more contained, the tension that had filled the space below dissolving into something more reflective, something more personal, as Evelyn Carter stood facing the polished steel walls, her expression calm, unchanged, as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place. Daniel Carter stood beside her, his posture still composed, but the sharp edge of authority that had defined him moments ago had softened, replaced by a quiet attentiveness that only appeared when the room no longer required his command. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint hum of the elevator rising floor by floor, each number lighting up in steady progression, marking the passage of time in a way that felt slower than it actually was. Evelyn exhaled gently, not a sigh, not relief, just a natural release of breath, and her eyes moved slightly, catching Daniel's reflection in the mirrored wall. "You did not have to come down yourself," she said softly. Her tone carried no criticism, no tension, just a simple observation, as if she were acknowledging something that had already been understood between them. Daniel glanced at her reflection before meeting her eyes directly, his expression steady. "You called," he replied. It was not a justification. It was a fact. Evelyn gave a faint nod, accepting the answer without further question, because she understood what it meant, not just the words, but the intention behind them, the quiet agreement they had built over time, that when one of them called, the other showed up, no matter how small the moment might seem from the outside. The elevator continued its ascent, passing the 10th floor, then the 11th, the movement smooth, uninterrupted, and as the silence settled again, Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, studying her more closely now, not for reassurance, but for something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the situation downstairs. "Did they upset you?" he asked. The question was simple, but the tone carried a subtle weight, not protective, not forceful, just present, just attentive. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not because the question amused her, but because it revealed something familiar, something steady. "No," she said quietly. "They revealed themselves." The words were calm, almost reflective, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, absorbing the meaning, understanding it without needing explanation, because he had seen it too. Not just in this hotel, but in countless other places, in countless other forms. The elevator slowed as it approached the top floor, the motion barely noticeable until the soft chime signaled its arrival, and when the doors opened, the hallway beyond was quiet, lined with soft lighting and thick carpeting that muted every step, a space designed for privacy, for exclusivity, for those who were never expected to question whether they belonged. Evelyn stepped out first, her pace unhurried, her presence unchanged, moving down the hallway with the same quiet confidence she had carried into the building, as if the events of the past few minutes had not altered her in any visible way. Daniel followed beside her, not leading, not directing, simply present, and as they walked, the distance between them and the lobby below felt greater than the number of floors could measure, as if they had stepped into a different layer of the same place, one where appearances no longer dictated perception. At the end of the hallway, Evelyn paused in front of a door, not hesitating, not uncertain, just allowing a brief moment to settle, and then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a key card, sliding it smoothly into the lock. The soft click that followed was almost imperceptible, but it carried a quiet significance, not because of what it did, but because of what it confirmed. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the room beyond revealing itself in soft light, expansive, elegant, designed with the same attention to detail as the lobby below, yet somehow feeling entirely different now, because within this space, there was no judgment, no silent assessment, no need to prove belonging. Daniel stepped in after her, the door closing gently behind them, and for a moment, they both stood there, taking in the stillness, the contrast, the quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. Evelyn set her coat down over the back of a chair, her movement simple, unhurried, and as she turned back toward the window, where the city stretched out below in distant lights and quiet motion, her expression remained steady, unchanged, as if she had already moved beyond what had happened, leaving it behind without resistance. Daniel watched her for a second longer, then moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the same view, the same city. The same world where moments like the one downstairs would continue to happen, in different places, to different people, repeating themselves in patterns that rarely changed. "It will not happen again," he said after a moment, his voice low, certain, not as a promise of control, but as a commitment to standard. Evelyn did not look at him immediately. She continued watching the city for a second longer, then gave a small nod. "It will," she said quietly. Daniel turned slightly, surprised, not by the contradiction, but by the certainty in her tone. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm, grounded, unshaken. "Just not here," she added. The words settled into the room with a quiet clarity, and Daniel understood, not as a challenge, but as a truth, one that extended far beyond the walls of the hotel, far beyond their control, and in that moment, neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to correct, only the quiet understanding that dignity was not something a place could guarantee, only something people chose to give, or withhold, every single day. Down in the lobby, the silence did not break immediately after the elevator doors had closed, it lingered, stretched, settling into the marble and glass like a presence that refused to leave, and for those who remained, the weight of what had just happened did not fade, it deepened, because now there was no distraction, no unfolding event to focus on, only the realization itself, clear and unavoidable. Laura Whitmore stood exactly where she had been, but everything about her posture had changed, the controlled confidence that once defined her replaced by a stillness that carried awareness rather than authority, and for the first time since she had taken that position, she was not managing the room, she was part of it, exposed within it. One of the attendants shifted slightly behind the desk, her voice hesitant when she finally spoke. "Should we continue check-ins?" she asked quietly, as if unsure whether normal operations were still appropriate in a space that no longer felt normal. Laura did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved slowly across the lobby, taking in the faces, the subtle glances, the way guests now looked not just at the decor, but at the people behind it, as if reassessing everything they had assumed about the place, and in that moment, she understood something that had never been part of her training, something that could not be written into any manual. Reputation was not built in the design of the building. It was built in moments like this. "Yes," she said finally, her voice quieter, more grounded, lacking the sharp edge it once carried. "We continue." But the words did not restore the room. They only acknowledged that time would keep moving, even if understanding had not fully settled yet. At the front desk, the attendants resumed their work, their movements more careful now, more deliberate, their smiles less automatic, their eyes more attentive, as if they were seeing each guest for the first time, not as a category, not as a profile, but as an individual, and the shift, though subtle, was real. A man approached the desk, dressed simply, carrying a small overnight bag, and for a brief moment, the attendant hesitated, not because she did not know what to do, but because she now understood what it meant to choose how to do it. Then she smiled, genuine this time, not practiced. "Welcome," she said. "How may I help you today?" The difference was quiet, but unmistakable. Across the lobby, the concierge adjusted his posture, his earlier assumptions dissolving into something more cautious, more aware, and even the bellhop, standing near the entrance, watched each new arrival with a different kind of attention, no longer scanning for status, but for presence. The room had not returned to what it was. It had become something else. Laura turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the entrance, where the revolving doors continued their steady motion, letting people in and out without judgment, without hesitation, and she realized how easily she had allowed herself to become the opposite of that, a filter rather than a guide, a gate rather than a welcome. The realization did not come with comfort. It came with clarity. A senior manager, alerted by the earlier tension, approached from the side hallway, his expression serious, his pace controlled, and as he reached Laura, he lowered his voice. "I have been informed," he said. Laura nodded once, her composure returning, not as it had been before, but as something more grounded, something that no longer relied on assumption. "So have I," she replied. He studied her for a moment, searching for signs of resistance, of deflection, but found none. Only awareness, and after a brief pause, he nodded back, understanding that whatever conversation would follow did not need to happen here, not in front of everyone, because the real impact had already taken place. As he stepped away, Laura remained still for a second longer, then turned back toward the desk, her focus sharper now, not on control, but on correction, not on maintaining image, but on restoring something that had been overlooked. The lobby continued to move, guests arriving, conversations resuming, footsteps echoing softly across the marble, but beneath it all, there was a new layer, something quieter, something more intentional, as if every person in the room had become slightly more aware of the space they occupied and the choices they made within it. And though no one spoke about what had happened, though no announcement was made, no explanation given, the lesson remained, carried in the way voices softened, in the way eyes met rather than passed over, in the way presence replaced assumption. The hotel had not changed its appearance. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble still reflected light, the structure remained the same. But something within it had shifted, something invisible, something that could not be measured in square footage or design, something that would reveal itself not in grand moments, but in small ones, in every quiet interaction that followed. And in that subtle transformation, the room held on to a truth that no policy had ever enforced, that respect was not a service offered to some, but a standard extended to all, and once understood, it could not be unseen. Upstairs, the room remained quiet long after the city lights had settled into their steady glow, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but complete, as Evelyn Carter stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded in a way that suggested she had already moved beyond the moment downstairs, not because it was insignificant, but because she understood it too well to dwell on it. Daniel Carter sat at the edge of the seating area behind her, his jacket folded neatly over the arm of a chair, his gaze directed not at the city, but at her, as if measuring something unspoken, something that had nothing to do with the hotel, and everything to do with what it represented. "You have seen that before," he said after a moment, his voice low, not questioning, but acknowledging. Evelyn did not turn immediately. Her eyes remained on the city, on the movement below that continued without interruption, cars passing, lights shifting, people moving through their own moments, unaware of what had unfolded just a few floors above them. "Many times," she replied softly. Her voice carried no weight of resentment, no trace of frustration, only a quiet acceptance, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from understanding patterns that repeat themselves regardless of place or status. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely in front of him, absorbing her answer in silence before speaking again. "And it never surprises you?" he asked. This time, Evelyn turned, her gaze meeting his, steady, thoughtful. "It used to," she said. "When I thought people only judged when they were certain." She paused, just long enough for the thought to settle. "Now I know they judge when they are comfortable." The words hung in the room, simple, precise, carrying more weight than their length suggested, and Daniel held her gaze, considering them, understanding the truth within them without needing further explanation. He had seen it too, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in quiet decisions made behind closed doors, the same instinct, the same assumption, the same quiet separation between those who belonged and those who did not. Evelyn moved away from the window, her steps soft against the carpet, and took a seat across from him, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as if the conversation itself was not heavy, but natural, part of a rhythm they had long understood. "What you said downstairs," she continued, her voice even, "about standards being revealed when tested, that is true." Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the reflection without interruption. "But standards are only real if they are lived when no one is watching." He studied her for a moment, then allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form, not out of amusement, but recognition, because what she said was not new, but it was always worth hearing again, especially in moments like this. "That is why it matters," he replied. Evelyn gave a small nod, her gaze drifting briefly toward the door, as if acknowledging the distance between this room and the lobby below, not in floors, but in perspective. "It matters because someone else will walk through that door tomorrow," she said. "And they will not know what happened today." Daniel followed her glance, his expression thoughtful, the implication clear, the responsibility extending beyond the moment, beyond the consequence, into something ongoing, something that required consistency rather than reaction. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, not filled with tension, not waiting for resolution, but settled, reflective, as if both of them understood that the real work did not happen in moments of exposure, but in the quiet choices that followed them. After a few seconds, Daniel stood, adjusting his sleeves with a small, habitual motion, his posture returning to its composed alignment, but now carrying something more measured, more intentional. "The review will begin in the morning," he said. "Policies will be clarified. Training will be adjusted." Evelyn watched him, her expression unchanged, then gave a slight shake of her head, not in disagreement, but in refinement. Policies do not change behavior, she said gently. Daniel paused, considering, then looked at her again. People do. The correction was soft, but precise, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the distinction did not need elaboration. It was clear. It was understood. Evelyn stood as well, walking back toward the window, her reflection once again merging with the city lights beyond, and as she looked out, her voice came quietly, almost as if she were speaking more to the world outside than to the room itself. Then the right people have to choose differently, she said. Daniel joined her at the window, standing beside her, both of them looking out at the same view, the same city that would continue to move, unchanged by what had happened within the walls of one hotel, yet shaped in small ways by every decision made inside it. And in that shared silence, there was no urgency, no need to resolve anything further, only the quiet understanding that what had happened was not an ending, but a beginning, not a correction, but a reminder, and that the true measure of what mattered would not be found in what was said that day, but in what was done the next. Morning arrived without announcement, the first light of day slipping quietly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, softening the edges of the city below, and inside the suite, the stillness remained, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, as if the space itself understood that what had begun the night before was not yet finished. Evelyn Carter stood near the window once again, a cup of coffee resting lightly in her hands, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady as she watched the city wake, people moving with purpose, unaware that within the walls above them, decisions were already beginning to reshape something they would never directly see, but would eventually feel. Behind her, Daniel Carter adjusted the cuff of his shirt, the quiet precision of his movements matching the tone of the morning, controlled, intentional, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now it was directed forward, toward what came next. "The meeting starts in 15 minutes, he said. Evelyn nodded slightly, not turning yet, her eyes still on the horizon. "Then we should not be late," she replied. There was no urgency in her tone, no pressure, just a quiet acknowledgement that time would move, and they would move with it. Downstairs, the lobby had already begun to fill again, the early guests checking out, new arrivals stepping in, the rhythm of the hotel returning, but not entirely the same, because something beneath it had shifted, something subtle but present, shaping the way each interaction unfolded. Laura Whitmore stood behind the front desk, her posture straight, her expression composed, but different now, not sharpened by authority, but grounded in awareness, and as she greeted each guest, her voice carried a tone that was no longer rehearsed, but chosen. "Good morning," she said to a man approaching the desk, her eyes meeting his fully, not scanning, not assessing, simply acknowledging. "How may I assist you today?" The man smiled slightly, returning the greeting, and for a brief moment, the exchange felt simple, but real, and that difference, though small, was everything. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room doors on the mezzanine level closed quietly, sealing in a group of individuals whose decisions would carry weight far beyond the walls they sat within, department heads, senior staff, and at the center, Daniel Carter, his presence commanding without effort, his expression steady, his attention focused not on reaction, but on direction. Evelyn sat beside him, not leading the room, not addressing it, but observing, her silence carrying its own presence, one that did not need to assert itself to be felt. The meeting began without ceremony, without preamble, Daniel's voice cutting cleanly through the room, calm, measured, and absolute. "Yesterday," he said, "a decision was made in this building that did not reflect our values." He did not raise his voice, did not dramatize the moment, because he did not need to, the weight of his words carried through the room on its own, settling into every seat, every posture, every breath. "We are not here to assign blame," he continued. "We are here to understand how it happened." The shift in tone was intentional, moving the focus from punishment to awareness, from reaction to responsibility, and as he spoke, the room remained silent, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because each person present understood that this was not about one interaction, it was about a system, a mindset, a pattern that had been allowed to exist unnoticed until it was too visible to ignore. Laura sat among them, her posture steady, her gaze forward, listening, not defensively, not searching for justification, but absorbing, allowing the moment to shape her understanding rather than protect her from it. Daniel's eyes moved across the room, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging all of them equally. Standards are not written in policy manuals, he said. They are practiced in moments when no one is watching. The words echoed the conversation from the night before, but here, in this room, they carried a broader meaning, one that extended beyond individuals into culture, into expectation, into the foundation of everything the hotel claimed to represent. Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze moving across the room, and though she did not speak, her presence reinforced the point in a way words could not, because she had been the moment, she had been the test, and the room understood that without needing it to be said. Daniel paused, allowing the silence to settle, then continued, his tone unchanged. We will review our training. We will refine our processes. But more importantly, we will change how we see the people who walk through our doors. The statement was simple, but it carried a weight that extended beyond instruction, into intention, into choice, and as it settled into the room, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but deeply, because this was no longer about correcting a mistake, it was about redefining a standard. Outside the conference room, the hotel continued its morning routine, guests moving, staff working, the building alive with quiet activity, but within that movement, something had changed, something that would not be announced, would not be displayed, but would reveal itself over time, in small interactions, in brief moments, in the way one person chose to see another. And as the meeting continued, the foundation of that change began to take shape, not through force, not through fear, but through understanding, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends, but remains, guiding every decision that follows. The meeting did not end with applause or resolution, it ended the way meaningful things often do, in quiet understanding, in subtle shifts that could not be measured in the moment but would define everything that followed, and as the conference room doors opened once more, the individuals inside stepped back into the rhythm of the hotel carrying something unseen but undeniable, a recalibration of perspective that would influence every decision from that point forward. Laura Whitmore walked out among them, her posture still composed, but her expression different, no longer guarded, no longer driven by the need to maintain control, but grounded in something more reflective, something that had taken root during the conversation and refused to be ignored. She paused just outside the room, her eyes briefly closing as if allowing the weight of it all to settle fully, and when she opened them again, the world looked the same, but not in the same way. The lobby below was active now, the late morning flow in full motion, guests arriving with luggage, others checking out, conversations blending into a low hum of activity that defined the space, but beneath that familiar surface, Laura could see the difference, not in the structure, not in the decor, but in the people, in the way they moved, in the way they looked at one another, and she realized that change had already begun, not as a directive, but as a choice. She made her way down the staircase rather than taking the elevator, each step deliberate, each movement aligned with a new awareness that no longer allowed her to move on instinct alone, and when she reached the bottom, she did not immediately return to her position behind the desk. Instead, she paused, observing, watching the interactions unfold around her, noticing the details she had once overlooked. A young woman approached the front desk, her clothes simple, her posture slightly hesitant, and for a brief second, Laura saw the reflection of the previous day in that moment, the same setup, the same opportunity for assumption, but this time, the response was different. The attendant greeted her with a genuine smile, her tone warm, her attention focused entirely on the person in front of her, not scanning, not categorizing, simply present. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady. "How can I help you today?" The young woman's shoulders relaxed almost immediately, her hesitation dissolving under the weight of something so simple, yet so powerful, acknowledgement. Laura watched this exchange in silence, and something within her settled, not relief, not redemption, but alignment, as if the lesson had not just been understood, but integrated, becoming part of the way the space now functioned. She stepped forward then, moving behind the desk, her presence returning to its place, but not as it had been before, because now it carried intention rather than assumption. "Good morning," she said to the next guest, her eyes meeting theirs fully, her tone steady, her attention complete, and the difference, though subtle, was unmistakable. Across the lobby, the concierge leaned slightly forward as he assisted an older man with directions, his voice patient, his manner attentive, no longer rushing through the interaction, no longer prioritizing efficiency over presence, and even the bellhop, standing near the entrance, greeted each arriving guest with the same level of respect, regardless of appearance, as if the standard had finally become what it was always meant to be. Upstairs, Daniel Carter stood near the window of the conference room, watching the city below once more, his posture composed, his expression thoughtful, and though the meeting had ended, the responsibility had not, because he understood that change was not enforced in a single moment, it was sustained through consistency, through attention, through the quiet reinforcement of values that could not be delegated. Evelyn Carter stood beside him, her presence calm, her gaze steady, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the shift they had set in motion was already unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the only way that mattered, quietly, consistently, in real time. "It begins like this," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the same calm certainty it always had. Daniel nodded. Slightly, his eyes still on the city, understanding that what she meant was not just the hotel, not just this moment, but something larger, something that extended beyond walls and policies and meetings. "And it continues," he replied. Evelyn gave a small nod, her gaze moving back toward the room, toward the space where decisions had just been made, and as she turned to leave, her steps were unhurried, her presence unchanged, because she knew what mattered was not what had been said, but what would be done next. Downstairs, the lobby continued its rhythm, but now, each interaction carried a different weight, a different awareness, as if every person who walked through those doors was no longer being measured against expectation, but welcomed into a space that had finally remembered what it was meant to be. And in that quiet transformation, the hotel did not just maintain its reputation, it redefined it, not through design or luxury, but through something far more enduring, the simple, consistent choice to see people for who they were, rather than who they appeared to be. By late afternoon, the hotel no longer felt like the same place it had been the day before, not because anything visible had changed, the chandeliers still cast their golden light across the marble floors, the furniture remained perfectly arranged, the uniforms crisp and identical, but because the invisible structure beneath it all had shifted, something subtle yet unmistakable, something that could not be written into a handbook or displayed in a brochure, yet could be felt in every interaction, in every glance, in every tone of voice that now carried intention rather than assumption. Laura Whitmore stood at her station once again, but the way she occupied that space had transformed, no longer positioned as a gatekeeper deciding who qualified for service, but as a host ensuring that everyone who entered was seen, and as she greeted each guest, her focus remained steady, her attention undivided, as if she understood now that the smallest moment carried the greatest weight. A man in work clothes approached the desk, his hands rough, his posture slightly uncertain as he stepped onto the polished floor that did not seem built for him, and for a fraction of a second, the old pattern could have returned, the quiet categorization, the instant judgment, but it did not, because Laura had already made her choice before he even reached her. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm, her eyes meeting his fully. "How can I assist you today?" The man hesitated, then relaxed slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he explained that he was there to meet someone, and Laura listened, not rushing, not redirecting, simply present, and when she guided him toward the correct elevator, her tone carried the same level of respect she had once reserved only for those who appeared to deserve it. Across the lobby, the change continued to ripple outward, not forced, not announced, but naturally reinforced through repetition, through consistency, as each staff member adjusted not because they were told to, but because they now understood why it mattered. The concierge no longer scanned for signals of status before offering assistance, instead, he responded to presence, to need, to the simple act of someone asking for help, and even the subtle gestures had shifted, the way doors were opened, the way eye contact was held, the way voices softened rather than sharpened, all small, all seemingly insignificant, yet together forming something far more powerful than policy alone. Upstairs, Evelyn Carter walked slowly through the quiet hallway, her steps soft against the carpet, her expression calm, not as someone inspecting a change, but as someone observing a pattern unfold, and as she reached the balcony overlooking the lobby, she paused, her gaze drifting downward, taking in the movement below, the rhythm that had returned, yet carried something new within it. Daniel Carter joined her a moment later, standing beside her without speaking, his presence steady, his attention focused not on the grandeur of the space, but on the details within it, the interactions, the choices being made in real time, and for a while, they both simply watched. A guest approached the desk, dressed elegantly, confident in his place within the environment, and he was greeted with the same warmth, the same attentiveness as the man before him, no difference in tone, no shift in priority, just consistency, and that was the change, not who was welcomed, but how. "It is working," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a note of acknowledgement rather than surprise. Evelyn gave a small nod, her eyes still on the lobby below. "For now," she replied. Daniel turned slightly, considering her words, understanding that what she meant was not doubt, but realism. That change was not proven in a single day, not secured by a single decision, but tested over time, in moments when attention faded, when pressure returned, when habits attempted to reclaim their place. "Then it has to be repeated," he said. Evelyn looked at him then, her expression steady, her voice calm. "It has to be chosen," she corrected. The distinction settled between them, clear, precise, because repetition could be mechanical, but choice required awareness, required intention, required something deeper than routine. Below them, the lobby continued its flow, guests arriving, staff assisting, conversations blending into a steady hum, and yet beneath it all, there was a quiet consistency that had not been there before, something that did not stand out, but did not fade either, something that remained present in every exchange. Evelyn's gaze lingered for a moment longer, then she turned away, her steps unhurried as she moved back down the hallway, not needing to watch any further, because she understood that what mattered now was not observation, but continuation, not what had been corrected, but what would be sustained. Daniel remained for a second longer, his eyes still on the lobby, on the space that had nearly forgotten its purpose and was now remembering it again, and as he finally turned to follow her, the quiet certainty settled in, not as confidence, but as responsibility, because what had been revealed could not be ignored, and what had been learned could not be undone. And in that quiet progression from moment to habit, from realization to action, the hotel did not just recover from what had happened, it began to redefine itself, not through grand gestures, not through visible change, but through something far more lasting, the consistent decision to treat every person who entered not as a category, but as a guest. Evening returned with the same quiet elegance the hotel had always carried, but now it felt different in a way that could not be captured in photographs or described in brochures, something subtle yet unmistakable, woven into the rhythm of the place, into the way voices rose and softened, into the way footsteps slowed instead of rushed, into the way people were seen before they were evaluated. The lobby glowed under warm light as guests moved through the space, some arriving, some departing, each carrying their own stories, their own expectations, their own unspoken questions about where they belonged, and for the first time in a long while, the answer they received did not depend on how they looked or what they wore, but on something far simpler, something that had always been there, waiting to be remembered. Laura Whitmore stood near the front desk, no longer anchored rigidly behind it, but moving when needed, stepping forward when someone hesitated, her presence no longer a barrier, but a bridge, and as she greeted a couple entering through the revolving doors, her voice carried warmth that did not feel practiced, her eyes steady, her attention real. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome." There was no hesitation in her tone, no quiet calculation behind her expression, just a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than any policy ever could, and the couple responded with ease, their shoulders relaxing as they stepped further into the space, as if something invisible had already assured them they were welcome. Across the room, the staff moved with a similar awareness, not perfectly, not mechanically, but intentionally, and that intention, though quiet, reshaped everything, because it was consistent, because it was chosen, because it was no longer dependent on who stood in front of them. Upstairs, Evelyn Carter walked slowly through the suite, her steps unhurried, her expression calm as always, the city lights reflecting softly through the glass behind her, and as she paused near the window once more, her gaze drifting outward, there was no trace of the moment that had unfolded the day before in her posture, no lingering tension, no need to revisit what had already served its purpose. Daniel Carter stood nearby, reviewing a document on the table, his focus steady, but not distant, and after a moment, he set it aside, his attention shifting toward her, not because something needed to be said, but because something had already been understood. "It is quieter tonight," he said. Evelyn gave a small nod, her eyes still on the city. "It is clearer," she replied. The distinction was subtle, but it carried meaning, because quiet could be empty, but clarity was something earned, something that came after confusion had been faced and understood. Daniel stepped beside her, his gaze following hers, the city stretching out in layers of light and motion, unchanged by what had happened within the hotel, yet somehow connected to it in a way that could not be measured. "Do you think they will remember?" he asked after a moment. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Her gaze lingered on the movement below, on the countless lives unfolding independently of this place, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, certain. "Some will," she said. "And some will forget." Daniel nodded slightly, the answer neither surprising nor disappointing, because it reflected something true, something constant, something that extended far beyond a single moment or a single space. "Then it depends on the ones who remember," he said. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his, and for a brief second, there was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken yet complete. "It always does," she replied. The room fell into silence again, but it was not empty, it was full, filled with the quiet certainty that what had happened had mattered, not because it had been dramatic, not because it had been visible, but because it had revealed something that could no longer be ignored. Down in the lobby, a new guest stepped through the doors, pausing for just a second as they took in the space, their posture uncertain, their presence unassuming, and before that uncertainty could settle into discomfort, a voice reached them, warm, steady, genuine. "Welcome," someone said. The guest looked up, surprised, then nodded, stepping forward with a little more confidence than before, and the moment passed quietly, almost unnoticed, yet it carried everything. No announcement marked the change, no sign declared it, no speech reinforced it, but it existed, alive in every interaction, in every choice, in every second where someone could have judged and instead chose to see. And as the night deepened and the hotel continued its steady rhythm, there was a quiet truth that remained, not spoken, not displayed, but present in the way the space held itself, that dignity was never something granted by wealth or status, but something recognized through action, and once that recognition took root, it changed not just a moment, but everything that followed, leaving behind a silence that no longer carried judgment, but understanding.